Thank you. One of the hallmarks of the Progress Seminar from year to year is that we really try to spark discussion, debate, and dialogue. And as you saw in the 5 panels represented this morning, we really tried to bring in new people, new faces, perspectives on multiple sides of any issue. We want this to be a time where each of you in the room can take back nuggets of information and things that you've learned, new friendships and relationships that have come from the Progress Seminar, and work in your various industries, your volunteer work, your elected positions, and really figure out what works for all of you, what works for your constituents, your customers, what works for your communities. So in the spirit of really thinking broadly and kind of thinking outside what I've heard time and time again, our Silicon Valley bubble, that we don't fully sometimes understand what is happening in different parts of the country or even different parts of the state. We have a very, very special guest speaker for lunch today. Victor Davis Hanson is the Martin and Illie Anderson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is also in residence in classics and military history at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and he's a professor of classics emeritus at Cal State Fresno and a nationally syndicated columnist for Tribune Media Services. How many in the room have read some of Mr. Hanson's columns? Okay, well, more of you are going to start reading. He is also the Wayne and Marcia Buskey Distinguished Fellow in History at Hillsdale College, where he teaches each fall semester courses in military history and classical culture. Mr. Hanson was awarded the National Humanities Medal in 2007, the Bradley Prize in 2008, as well as the William F. Buckley Prize in 2015, the Claremont Institute Statesmanship Award in 2006, and the Eric Brandel Award for Opinion Journalism in 2002. Mr. Hanson was the 5th successive generation to live in the same house on his family's farm, which was a full-time orchard and vineyard grower from 1980 to 1984, before he joined CSU Fresno. His bio has many more things a part of it, and it's in your program, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. But we'd really like to bring him up here to the stage because the topic of his talk today is California, its dilemmas, its paradoxes, and its challenges. In a big San Mateo County welcome, Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you very much. I'll try to speak for 30 or so minutes and then open it up to questions. And I'd like to look at the state not as an analyst or a partisan, but as a historian in comparative terms. I was a historian of Western civilization, so I always try to look where we are in comparison to Renaissance or classical Greece or Rome. And before I start, I'll give you 4 little incidents that happened to me in the last 72 hours that I think illustrate what I meant by paradoxes, challenges, and dilemmas. So I was supposed to go to a luncheon yesterday in San Francisco at 11:30, and as a student at Stanford in 1975 to 1980, it always seemed to me it'd take about an hour. But I thought to myself, this being California in the new millennium, I'm going to start 2 hours for my 34-mile drive. And then as I was walking out, my assistant says, I would take 3. So I left at 9 o'clock for 11:45, and I entered the biggest power outage in the city's history in the financial district. And as I was sitting there watching total chaos, the most sophisticated, wealthy people in the history of civilization, it was like a jungle. They were cramming through the streets. Nobody was obeying crosswalks. Some volunteers were trying to direct flag. People were cutting in. I thought we're just back to the jungle suddenly. How could the most sophisticated, wealthiest city, the highest priced housing in the United States, reverts from being postmodern to pre-modern in a blink of an eye? I thought, well, these things happen. So I was going to come up here from Stanford today, and I had been also a student at UC Santa Cruz in the 70s, and I remember 101, a state who had a population at that time 19 million. Today it's 40, and I realized that 101 near Morgan Hill has not changed at all in the 45 years in which I used to drive it. So I thought, well, my navigation says 78 miles, 1 hour and 15 minutes. But I thought, it's Saturday morning, I have to speak at 1:20. Just to be safe, I'll leave at 10. I called my daughter who lives in Santa Cruz, and she said, I wouldn't try it if I were you unless you leave at 9. I said, that's ridiculous. 4 hours? I was humming along at Morgan Hill, and I stayed 2.5 hours to go 25 miles today on 101. And then on the way up, Thursday, from my farm between Visalia and Fresno, I've lived there my entire life. My great-great-grandmother built the house that I live in. We're a very multiracial family. My brothers are married to Mexican-American citizens. My kids were in the public schools, but I went to a local canteen, and I had been disturbed because it's Mexican-American food, but over the last few years, the menu has changed to only Spanish, and only the Mexican flag was waving, and half the people who drive in had Mexican decals. So I stop there sometimes, I know the owner, and I said, this doesn't make, I'd always kid him and said, it makes no sense to wave the flag that you don't want to go back to, but not the flag of the country in which you wish to stay. I'm just talking from an Aristotelian logical point of view. And he laughs, he's undocumented. And I went the other day, and there were 3 flags, an American flag, a California flag, and a U.S. Marine Corps flag. The menu was all in English, and I asked why that was, and I'm not commentating editorially. He just said that F Trump. And I thought, wow, that is a very strange lesson on deterrence. Why would somebody change so radically? And is that in the tradition of assimilation, integration, and intermarriage and a good thing, or is it a bad thing? It shows you these dilemmas that we're all dealing with. Part of the reasons why I mean dilemma is that we are a postmodern and a pre-modern society all at once. I've been given a great gift because I live in southern Fresno County in an area that's the second poorest in California. My hometown is 90% Hispanic. Most of the middle class is all left. All the neighbors I grew up with have gone away, sold their farms. There's no more family farming. It's all corporate farm. It's a pyramidal society between an elite that doesn't live in the area, that owns land, and mostly people with heritage from India or Southeast Asia, but mostly from Mexico and Central America. And so then I drive, should be 3 hours, 178 miles to my job at Stanford each week, and I enter a post-San Mateo County. I think the per capita income is about 116 or something, one of the most affluent places. And at the Stanford campus, one of the most highly educated places. And it's a disconnect. It's almost like leaving one planet to another. It really is striking in such a 4 hour, I shouldn't say 4, sometimes it's 6 hours, given the, so what I mean by that is what I just said about the roads. Fortune magazine just rated California's infrastructure, specifically its roads and freeways, 49th in the nation. Thank God for Mississippi. Because I remember driving on other roads and then in the 60s coming back to California and thinking we invented the freeway and the cloverleaf. It's such a advanced modern society. 49th in the country. And yet where I live, it's almost as if there is a monument to futility. There is the beginning of high-speed rail. Almost 8 years ago we authorized it. Critics of it, of course, exaggerate what the proposed cost, but I think everybody realizes that it's not going to be 8 or 10 billion, but eventually maybe 100 billion. And there's this sort of halfway overpass with 3 columns on it. It's a monument. But what I'm getting at is that's an expression of Californians' utopian hopes, but were you to drive 3 miles away, you would see the Amtrak line from Fresno to Corcoran, and it can't even go over the Ridgeway. So if you want to take a train to Los Angeles, you have to take a bus at Bakersfield. If you want to go in the 99 and you get past Kingsburg and you go to Turlock, it's 2 lanes. It hasn't changed at all since it's one of the most dangerous. I wrote a column once called Highway of Death, and I got deluged by trucking companies and say, well, you're an idiot. Why would you ever go on that? All of our drivers don't set foot on that nightmare. I was driving last week. Somebody dropped a mattress on the 99. It shut down the main north-south central arterial in California for about 4 hours. Caused a big wreck. So my question is, before you want to live in the late 21st century, don't you think you should live in the 19th century and have a rail that works or a highway that is safe? And that, again, captures this dilemma that we can't deal with the mundane, so we dream about the fantastical. And almost it gives a psychological resonance and reconciliation. We can't deal with the mess in our midst, but we can dream of high-speed rail, and that'll solve everything. But as a society, we don't have the pragmatic tools to do high-speed rail because we can't do the 99 and we can't do the Amtrak. We have the highest now basket of taxes, not in each individual category, but if you were to look at our new tax rates, income tax, top brackets 13, many of you fall in the 9, 10, 11, 12. This is on top of the 39 federal and the 4 or 5. So in theory, I don't know what your effective rate is, but you could easily see where you could be with payroll tax, 55% of your income. California's gas tax is going up. Its sales tax is, I think, 5th in the country. Its income tax now is 2nd. And so such a highly taxed state should have the best infrastructure in the country. And as I said, we're 49th in the country as far as highways. In education, think about this. We used to have the best state tripart system in the world. It was really brilliant. The UC campus, 9 UC campuses, the 23 state campuses, largest system in the world, 275,000 students, the JC system. When I started teaching at Cal State Fresno, the remediation rate, that's a fancy word that administrators say that people admitted cannot do basic math or English and cannot take a college course unless they can do so, was 28%. When I left, it was 52%. So half the students I had, so for somebody who was teaching classical literature to mostly poor students of all different backgrounds, it meant that I looked at my syllabus in 1984 and I had 11 assigned readings, everything from the Odyssey to the Inferno to Montesquieu. When I left, I had one assigned author. And if some of you say, well, you're cynical. No, it was empirical. I'd ask students to come in and read out loud, and I would take my watch and see how long it took them to read a page, and then I would times how many pages were assigned. And I said, these students cannot read more than 300 pages in 15 weeks, whereas a prior generation was reading over 1,500. At the same time, the Times Educational Supplement, along with the University of Japan, each of these, you know these surveys, the top 200 universities in the world. Last year's rating had 5 universities in California rated in the top in the world out of the top 15. Caltech was number 1, Stanford was number 2, UC Berkeley was number 6, UCLA was 12, and USC was 15. And yet our school test scores at grade 8 are 46th in the nation. In other words, California had more top universities rated by non-Americans than any other country in the world except the United States itself. And yet, by all accords, it has one of the worst public school systems in the world. How can that be? It doesn't make any sense. It's a disconnect that it just boggles the mind. We are being praised because our percentage of green energy is higher than it ever has been, and it's actually higher than any other state. I can say, I think you're all proud. We have an enormous and growing solar industry. The percentage of kilowatts generated is very impressive, and yet Southern California Edison, especially PG&E, have among, I think we're number 2 in kilowatt cost. So I don't know if you've looked at your power bill lately, but it's been recalibrated. And I know a lot of people in the San Joaquin Valley that just don't use appliances anymore. So I was thinking the other day, how could we be the most sophisticated country in the world or state in the union, and yet we can't provide a basic service of reliable power at an affordable price to very poor people? We have the highest number of billionaires of any state. I think it's 91. And yet 1/3 of all people on federal assistance live in California. 23% of the population lives below the poverty line. Sometimes you can see it. It's striking. I can think of, old London in the 17th century. I can think of Rome as described by Juvenal in the 1st century. But if you go to Redwood City and walk over not too far to Atherton, it's like Mercury and Venus. The disconnect is so large. When we look at water, the California Water Project and the federal Central Valley Water Project were the most sophisticated projects in the world in the 1950s and 60s. Our grandparents said, we live in a dilemma because 1/3 of the people, 1/3 of the state is where everybody wants to live, and 2/3 of the state's where all the water is. As I said to somebody who was complaining about canals, why don't we move Stanford to Eureka? We'd have all the water we need. Why do you dam water projects, but yet you get it from Hetch Hetchy and the Central Valley Project? So if you read those two plans, they say that it'll always be that way. Most of you would rather live in Silicon Valley or the Santa Clara Valley than you would up at Shaver Lake, California, or up, at Crescent City where there's plentiful water. In other words, you live in an artificial arid environment that your grandparents envisioned would need water transfers. And yet, this year, we have now the record rainfall at this time of year, 208% of normal. The California Water Project and the Central Valley Project were arrested in 1983. We considered that dams and reservoirs were something that were Neanderthal, they were reactionary, they were a paranoid generation. At 23 million people, 24 million people, we stopped building them. We did not build the Sites Reservoir. We did not build this Los Manos Grandes, the huge Temperance Flat. It would be the size of 3 San Luis. Some of you, I can understand why you didn't want to build on the Klamath River 11 million acre feet, or the Dos Rios up in Napa Valley 2 million acre feet. But those are all choices that people have at 23 million people, not 40 million who want to live in an area where there's no water, or they want to farm, or they want to work, or they want to produce in an area that's no water. In the old days, if you read the preamble of these brilliant projects, they said, we're going to do 4 things for California. We're going to give the middle class a chance to have a vacation experience like the wealthy, and they're going to go up to artificial lakes like Huntington Lake or Lake Isabella, and they're going to have access to mountain lakes like the wealthy do at Tahoe, which is not a man-made lake. 2, we're going to let people live in floodplains, as you saw with the Oroville Dam. It's a very unnatural place to live because Feather River floods. But we're going to allow people to live in these beautiful valleys because they're going to have dams and reservoirs. And number 3, we're going to open up 5 million acres of farmland on the west side by using these reservoirs for irrigation purposes. And we're going to provide cheap hydroelectric power. Henry Huntington went up to the Big Creek in 1912 and created a power grid that was larger than any in the nation until the Hoover Dam supplied half the power of Los Angeles. They never said, never, you look at it, I've searched every word of both of those massive master plans. We're going to let out water to restore salmon runs of the 19th century in the San Joaquin River, and we're worried about a 3-inch bait fish in the delta, the smelt, that we believe might need more oxygenated water by letting water out of reservoirs to make the San Joaquin River and the Sacramento flow as if it's 1850. That's what we're doing at $50,000 a salmon in the San Joaquin River. Whatever your politics are, it just doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? We always had irrigation refill basins. So my little farm has 2. On a wet year, not as wet as this, but on a wet year, the consolidated irrigation of which you pay taxes says you don't need irrigation water in March and April or February, but we're going to use your ponds and fill them up so they'll recharge the water table. I have a pump in front of my house that my great-great-grandmother drilled in 1878. It was fine until last year. It tells me that we'd never had a problem. 51 feet. It's now 98 feet. It's dry. So I think that on a year like this, these irrigation ponds would be filled to the brim. No, they're empty. Why? Because people are transferring water from the Kings River, not into the irrigation district so they can recharge the water table, but on a bypass out to the San Joaquin River and out to the ocean. So what does that mean in real terms? If you add up all of the reservoirs in California that were built, I think there's 1,200 of them. They have a capacity of 42 million acre feet. It's a huge number. That meant that in 1983, you could stop building anymore, and that was plenty of water for 23 million people. It's not for 40. At that ratio, you should have had 80 million acre feet, or somebody should have said no more Californians can come in here, or you're going to have to change your lifestyle. Had to be one of the 3. Build more reservoirs, stop population growth, change your lifestyle. Instead, we, being Californians, grew anyway, didn't change our lifestyle, and didn't build any more reservoirs. In fact, we talk about destroying them. My point is that since November of last year, 52 million acre feet have been let out of the reservoirs to go to the ocean. Enough to fill all the reservoirs a second time. If you go to a place like Edison Lake or Florence Lake, any other year it would be filled, it's half filled. Why? Because in the midst of the most greatest gift from nature that we ever had, 208% of precipitation, we're letting water out to the ocean for river restoration, for fish development in the delta. It's a wonderful, noble thing to do that. It just doesn't work in a state where you have 1/5 of the people living below the poverty line, and you have people trying to produce food for the rest of them. And finally, why does this happen? I think the answer is not that there's bad liberals or bad conservatives or people who are nefarious. I think it's partly because of the weird structure of the state. From La Jolla to Point Reyes, within 50 or 60 miles of the coast, we have the wealthiest, brightest, most educated people in the world. Somewhere around 28 million people of our 40 million. But they inhabit, in terms of geography, a small percentage of California. So when you go into your kitchen, you look at that granite counter, it came from somewhere near Academy, California. To the extent that every third fill-up, that oil came from Bakersfield, California. The arugula you bought at Whole Foods, it came from either the Salinas Valley or the San Joaquin Valley. The wood floor you like, if you have a nice pine floor, that came from our forest. So the muscular classes who produce 19th century goods and services are governed, and I say governed because the vast majority of population governs the state from the coast, by people in postmodern, post-industrial, knowledge-based, informational directed, whatever, how we want to call that. And their lives are very different from not only past Californians, but present Californians outside the coast. $1 trillion has flowed into Silicon Valley. San Francisco is booming. The coast in general is booming. And it has created a climate that we're all in. I'm a part of it as a professor at Stanford, in which the full ramifications of our ideologies are somewhat exempt from our own personal experience. What do I mean by that fancy term? It means if my assistant tells me that he's for open borders, but he just doesn't like what's going on at Menlo Atherton, and he's putting his kids in Sacred Heart. I said it would be much better for your kids in the long run to put them into Menlo Park. My kids went to Selma High School, 90% Hispanic, and I think it was the best education they can get. We have enough SAT camps, we have enough all of that stuff. Pre-Stanford admission camps, we don't have enough where kids get along with each other and have to learn that there's another way of looking at the world, and it can be very brutal if you're poor. But again, people who want open borders or they're against school choice, they have a mechanism to massage that so it doesn't affect them daily in their lives. I'm not accusing anybody, but I will tell you that as a historian, when I look at Castellea, or I look at Sacred Heart, or I look at Harker, I look at all the prep schools that have grown up or who have been there, who expanded, I'm reminded of the academies in the South. There's nothing quite like it. We had the most progressive people in the world here and the wealthiest, and you think the public schools would be booming. Instead, we have private academies. It's one of the most illiberal things that a historian has ever seen, and yet it's juxtaposed with opposition to such schools for everybody. I think that I'm a big fan of green power. I really am, not being cynical, but I have to understand that PG&E's rates and the way that they calibrate energy policy is made by people, again, that live on the coast. So I'm at the Hoover Tower on the 11th floor, the proverbial ivory tower. I have never turned on the heater or the air conditioning. There is no air conditioning in 14 years. It makes no difference to me what the price, even if I were to pay for it. I have an apartment, it doesn't matter much. By August 1st, in my hometown, you cannot get into the door of Walmart because Hispanic people cannot afford to turn on their air conditioning. It's 108 degrees, and they go into Walmart to sit there and enjoy the free air conditioning. And they say to me, who set these, why is our power bill so much? I said, well, you have a lifeline, you have something. No, not enough. So the people who set the power rates don't live in 110, just like the people who set the ideas about schools don't put their kids in there, just like water. So I talked to another professor at Stanford not long ago, and he said to me, well, you shouldn't be mad, you farmers. Crystal Springs is full. I said, why is it full? Well, we in the Bay Area have really good runoff strategies. I said, you think that water came from the arid foothills of San Francisco Bay? Are you insane? I said, well, where did it come from? I said, it came from something called Hetch Hetchy. And I said, after the destruction of San Francisco and the fire and the earthquake, brilliant great-grandfathers of ours said, this city is in a Mediterranean climate, and we can't grow unless we import water from the most beautiful area in the world. So we're going to go up and dam Hetch Hetchy, which John Muir said was more beautiful than Yosemite Valley, and we're going to take 3 canals, and we're going to go all the way and fill up Crystal Springs and all the other reservoirs. 17% of your water comes from ground wells. You don't have the aquifer to support what Silicon Valley has become, or San Francisco. Even Hetch Hetchy's not enough now. The California Water Project from Shasta and Oroville dams comes into the Bay Area. Why do I say that? Because every time I talk to people at Stanford, they say to me, either we should shut down Hetch Hetchy because we could let it revert to nature. I always say yes, promises, promises. And then the second thing is, well, there was too much agribusiness. I've been a long critic of agribusiness. I wrote 2 books championing family farming, which I think had a lot of cultural advantages over corporate agriculture. Maybe not economic, but cultural and social. But nevertheless, I always ask them the same question. So you want to divert irrigation water from the California Water Project, from Pine Flat Dam, from Millerton Lake, and you want it to fill the San Joaquin so it will let salmon, it'll get lush riverscapes, it'll go out to the Delta and counteract the 35 municipal waste districts that are dumping treated sewage into the Delta. They need fresh water to serve. And you like all that. But if you like it so much, why don't you just go over to the San Joaquin River where your Hetch Hetchy aqueducts come across? You could stop it right there and recharge the San Joaquin River with all of the Hetch Hetchy water. So we can't do that. I said, well, you can only take a shower once a week if you did that. In other words, the person I was talking to has never lived in a physical 19th century world. He didn't realize that the Bay Area is the most dependent of anywhere in the world on long-distance water transfers that came and wrecked one of the most scenic areas in the world, and we don't dare touch. But we like in the abstract, because we're not subject to the ramifications of our own ideology, to cut off all the other water projects. What's the answer to all this? I don't think it's a left-right political, all of these people talk about dividing the state up. The only way that makes sense, and it doesn't make sense, I'm just being facetious, would to divide not laterally, but longitudinally, somewhere along the coast ranges. And then all the people with a knowledge base would import all of the stuff from us Neanderthals who would live on our own culture, and then it would kind of be tense. It would be sort of like West Virginia and Virginia. I would go from one state to the next, and I would be in the morning cursing that nobody in Selma has ever heard of Homer's Iliad, and then cursing in the afternoon that nobody in the Stanford campus knows how to use a chainsaw. But I do that anyway. But that's the dichotomy. And that doesn't mean there's not a lot of Homeric scholars at California State, or there's not a number of brilliant chainsawers in San Mateo. Part of it is 40% of the state is Latino. I say that as somebody who lives in a racially mixed family. And whatever one's views are on illegal immigration, I think most people, for all the rhetoric of the last campaign, realize that there is a consensus that of the 11 to 15 million people here, most people believe that if you were here for 2 or 3 years, you're gainfully employed, you've avoided a criminal record, you should be given a chance for a green card. Whatever you do with that's your own business. If you want to apply for citizenship. Simpson, Missouri, only 1/3 of the people took opportunities to get citizenship. And then I think most people believe that if you don't have any history of work and you have a criminal record, you probably have to be deported. That's the center area. But immigration's not really the issue. I think the issue is integration, intermarriage, assimilation. When I hear an Italian name today, Giuliani, Cuomo, I have no idea what their politics are, do you? The Italian-American experience, if we were talking in 1920, we would say all those Italians from Sicily, they're all on government, they're all left-wing, but they have completely been embedded in a way that people said would be impossible. I think that had we not had the numbers of illegal entrants, we were working toward that goal. And what's happening now is if the border is changed and we have legal rather than illegal and it's measured and it's diverse and it's meritocratic, I think the same phenomenon is going to happen to the Hispanic population. It already is as we speak. The outlier was illegal immigration for a 30-year period that brought in somewhere around 40 million people under auspices, tragically so, of without legality, often without a high school diploma and without English. It made it very hard to assimilate. And I know that people resent that word, assimilation, integration, melting pot versus the diversity salad bowl, but it's always been the American melting pot success story that's not followed anywhere in the world. What am I getting at? That population is explosive electoral. And I think when you go to the San Joaquin Valley and talk to people, they're not talking any longer necessarily about saving 3-inch bait fish, or they're not worried about a new California law that makes it a felony that your dog chases a bobcat, or they're not even interested, and I'm a supporter of transgendered restrooms, but they're not interested in that, enforcing that in the public schools. You know what they're interested in? More water, cheaper power, the 99 that doesn't get my nephew killed, bread and butter issues that they feel have been completely neglected by this coastal establishment, even though they're in the same party. I say that as somebody who's a registered Democrat, and Jerry Brown appointed my mother the first female appellate court judge in California. So I have a long record of California Democratic politics, but I think what I'm getting at is that what our problem is in California and why you can't go on the freeway and get somewhere in time, or why we have water rationing, or why the governor said, and last year was a normal rain year, we're still in a drought, or why somebody said that it was climate change caused, I won't mention the legislator's name, but caused the drought, and then 3 months later he said it caused the excessive wet year. Maybe it did, but it was hard to communicate that to the population where I live. They don't like to be told that the weather and climate have irreversibly changed and they have to make adjustments, and then the next month told they've irreversibly changed and you're going to have wet weather. It's just not coherent. And so what I guess I'm getting at is that we all need to be very careful about what we say, how we vote, and not be so ideological, but remember that there's a long tradition in the West that before you can think, you can insure, you can finance, you can educate, you have to be able to eat, and you have to be able to go somewhere in a vehicle of some sort, and you have to have safety. And if you don't have that combination between the physical and the mental, deed and thought, then you end up where we're headed. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time, but if there's a question or two. Yeah, yep.
To pose the first question. Oh, please, this crowd. Come on. Bella Chu. Coming with the, whoa, sorry. Can I throw this?
I've never seen anything. That's a microphone?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Can you hear me?
I am from Fresno.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you talked about the water. I myself am a farm kid. Oh,
Yeah, thank
every day. I myself am a farm kid, and I remember during the drought, I was freaking out way more than anyone else I knew because I'd grown up in a place where if there was a drought, it meant everybody you knew was bankrupt. And I wondered if there's been a lot of progress in terms of dealing with, not rationing, but limits on the amount of groundwater people can take out and kind of a rationalization of the California water policy.
Well, here's what's happened. I think when people, before the drought, 2 years before the drought, decided that they wanted to replenish rivers and recalibrate the delta and cut off water supplies to, say, the west side, 5 million acres, they thought that agriculture would disappear. Because remember that east of Highway 41, the water table was between 20 and 100 feet. When you get out toward the Coast Ranges, on that vast I-5 corridor, Harris Ranch, all that area, it can go down to 1,700 feet. So nobody was able to pump. But I've learned that it's always a bad idea to bet against the ingenuity of California agribusiness people. They're the most brilliant people in the world. So what they did was, when the water was cut off, they did something nobody had ever done in the world. They dug wells not 400, 600, 800, they dug it down 2,000 feet. And when I turn on my well at 85 feet, a 15 horsepower pump at $1.50 an hour pumps 1,500 gallons. Theirs at $400 a gallon, $400 an hour only pumps about a tenth of that. But nevertheless, they survived. They spent about $2 billion. The water table is sinking, so they need that water to replenish the ground table. But they're in a catch-22. Everybody says, well, you're overdrafting the groundwater. Why are you doing that? And they're saying, we're doing that because you're letting the surface water go out to the ocean. And they're saying, we're letting them do that because you're only using this much. And they're trying to say, you don't understand California agriculture. We didn't waste it. We put it in recharge basins. And here's the greatest irony. I don't want to monopolize the answer, but everybody wanted drip irrigation. It's much more efficient in most cases. But in the 90s, laser leveling surface irrigation was in vogue. So all these farms you saw, they had laser level, they turned on an irrigated valve. The water in an hour went down almost a half a mile. They did it at night and they turned it off. They had very little transpiration, and the water they didn't use seeped down and recharged the water table. What are they doing now? They're just doing all drip, just enough to keep the plant going or productive, but no water recharge. And so the result is they're very economical in their water usage per acre, but they're very uneconomical in recharging the water table. And then when you add 40 million people into the equation, and what do I mean by that? If you look at the water allotments for the San Luis Reservoir, you all drive by on the way to Yosemite on 152, that used to be allocated to about 90%. That was why it was built, for agriculture. It's down to about 30%. Most of that water is from the aqueduct, pumped up there and stored, and then sent either to California Water Project laterals to the coast, so everywhere from Pismo Beach to Morro Bay to Santa Barbara would not exist without that water. San Jose now taps out of the San Luis Reservoir, and the rest goes down, and the highest aqueducts in the world, 2,500 feet, pump into Pyramid Lake. So people don't realize that because of municipal demands, the allotments to farming has gone way down, and they have made it up by sophisticated techniques that kept them very prosperous, costly, but I don't think they're sustainable. I don't think you can overdraw the water table that much. And they can't be blamed unless you want to shut it down and just say we don't need agriculture. And anyway, it's a damn if you do and damn if you don't situation. Yes, yeah.
Okay, we're gonna have to do this by throwing. I'm gonna throw to Rick.
Thank you. Professor. Yeah, Professor, thank you. Great job at telling us about ourselves. And you've said that you've studied a lot of civilizations out there across the world, across the U.S. Give us some hope. Who's doing it right, or where do you see patches of light or things that we can emulate?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. What did you say?
Give us a beacon of hope. Who's doing it right? Who can we emulate?
Well, I wish I could, but in the history of the last 2 centuries, when you ask that question, who's doing it right? It's always the United States. So I've gone to every country in the Middle East. I've gone over South America, Asia. They're all doing it wrong. And I used to be told that Europe had the answer. So when I go to Europe, I see an apartheid society in parts of England. England is basically an old English population in the rural area, and London is a very different city. Same thing, they have tensions. I lived in Greece 3 years. My biggest problem when I go to Greece is I don't have as much hair as I used to, but people say, "Este Germani, Germanos." And I say, "Oh, I'm not a German. I'm not a German. Don't hate me. I'm an American." When I went to school there, I'd always say, "I'm a German. Don't hate me. I'm not an American." And these are EU countries. So the EU, and if you look at the energy cost in Germany, they're about 4 times. I have a good friend in Germany that turns on his electricity about 5 hours a day, sort of like my parents told me it was in the 1920s and here. So it's either going to be us or nothing. Why? Because we're the only society that has a combination of a steady constitutional system. We have a Bill of Rights. We have a free market ideology that most people accept. You see, if I walk out in this parking lot, and believe me, I'll see a lot of Mercedes. And I drove up in my little Honda with 150,000 miles on it. I don't want to kick the tires in. Most Europeans would. I want to ask the guy how he got the Mercedes and how can I get one. And that's the difference in the American can-do, whether you can caricature it or not. So, and then we're the only multiracial society that's ever existed. Everybody who's tried what we're trying failed. The Austro-Hungarians failed, the Ottomans failed, Rwanda failed, the Shia, Kurds, and Sunni failed in Iraq. The Balkans failed after the collapse of Yugoslavia. The truth of the matter is every person is a tribal person who feels that their skin color or their religion is essential, not incidental to their character. I'm paraphrasing the great words of Martin Luther King, which said race is incidental here in America. That's what he wanted. So when we look at everybody from different backgrounds, we say your race and your identity are incidental. We don't really care about them. Your character is essential. That was very unnatural. Most people are tribal. All over the world, they're tribal. When I go to an Arab country, they always say, "Go to this window, my cousin works there." I never hear that. Nobody says to me at the DMV, "Hey, get in front of the line because my cousin works there." That's the way the world works. So I think sometimes that, we're either going to make it, the world's going to make it here in the United States, or it's not going to make it. And Libya was the 6th largest oil exporter in the world. When I went there in 2006, I can remember going from the airport to my hotel and stopping 4 times to help the driver lift the car out of a hole in the road because they didn't have enough asphalt in Libya. I won't even get into Venezuela. But so we're trying to do our best, but I think we've got to return to certain attitudes that gave us the power, the hygiene, the transportation of what we've had. And I'm not sure that a lot of it is just personal, that before you advocate something for somebody else, you should ask yourself, Do I follow my own ideology? Do I live it? Do I have a proper mixture between the physical and the mental, the active and the passive, the thoughtful and the muscular? And I try to, I think I drive my colleagues crazy because I always hear about people who, I'll just finish on one anecdote. I've written about 10,000 columns for 3 different venues in 30 years. I've written one column that I had over 1,000 hate letters from. Was it on race? No. Was it on global warming? Not even close. Illegal immigration? No. No. You know what it was on? I said, I had been eating by myself for 10 years in restaurants in your county, or my county, and I noticed that when I went to Redwood City, so many people were living in Winnebagos or 4 or 5 families, and they were the service people. They were getting much more than people do in Fresno for such service, maybe $15, $20 an hour, but that doesn't get you much when there's housing's $1 million. So all I suggested was this. As I was driving down Sand Hill, and I've done it for 40 years, so it's not like I'm a newcomer, I noticed that the highway's underused. 280 is not packed like 101. Beautiful landscapes from Stanford campus all the way to Crystal Springs. This huge Hetch Hetchy reservoir, plentiful water. Mass transit would be very feasible. I said, let's encourage affordable housing along that corridor. That's all I said. And I got letters of the type, and I thought they were caricatures. I actually called one of the people up because I said, was this a joke? And he said, I worked hard for my polo grounds, and I'm not going to be on my polo horse and look at a bunch of people living, And I thought, wow, I called him up. He left his name. It was serious. And yet, right a mile from where I live, we plowed up about 1,000 acres of Thompson seedless grapes. We have a new housing development. You can get about 2,000 square feet for about $140,000 at 3% FHA loan. Most of the people there are from Mexico. I go there all the time and talk to them. They have they have, no offense, they have nicer homes than most people in San Mateo County. And it's affordable. Do I lament the fact that I knew the Kaufman family, I knew the Snodgrass family, I knew the Hazelhofer family, that those small farms were beautiful farms, and they're all torn up, they're gone, nobody remembers who they are, their kids moved away, and then in their place is affordable housing. Yes, I upset that, but life's not between perfect and awful. It's 51% better than the alternative, and the alternative to that is a bunch of people in Fresno County living in trailers versus dignified housing. And so I think that before you can, we can do 2 things in San Mateo. You can say, our kids at Stanford are not going to be waiters in downtown Palo Alto. They're just too busy. Or we're going to have waiters, but we're going to give them a place to live so they don't live 5 people to a bedroom in Redwood City. And that requires some sacrifice. But believe me, the director, I'll finish that, he called me up, and he tried not to interfere. We get a lot of flack at Hoover from Stanford professor. He said, what did you write? And I just said, we should have affordable housing down the 280 corridor for 50 miles. And he said, are you insane? He said, you've cost us $10 million in donations this year, at least. So I want you to never write that again. Anyway, I don't know if we have time for one more or not.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Hi, with energy, wind farms, solar, coupled with desal, what part of the solution may that provide?
Well, as you know, per capita emissions use in the United States has gone down. In California, it's gone down quite a lot. Part of that's because of wind and solar. We're getting up to 20%, but most of it is due, to be frank, is the transformation of energy from coal to natural gas, something that I think the environmental industry is as ambiguous about as it is ambiguous about nuclear power. But natural gas has been the great contributor to a decrease in carbon emissions. So I think you know, I'm a person who believes in, as a farmer who still lives there, I always believe in self-sufficiency. So I don't like the idea that we lost 10 million trees and we're not because of the drought, and we're not self-sufficient in timber. We import about 70% of our timber from the Northwest and Canada. I don't like the idea that we import natural gas all the way from Canada when we have plentiful amounts from Bakersfield all along that southern I-5. So I think the answer is that it's a mixture for now until I'm sure that technology will solve the problem. It's already making wind and solar cheaper. We have all sorts of alternate power sources from hydrogen, et cetera, all the fuel cells, et cetera. And I think that's great. But for right now, I would like us to be trying to balance what we want to do and what allows people in Selma, California, not to have to sit there all day at Walmart so they don't die of heat prostration. Or if they go to work in Mendota or San Joaquin or farming and they're buying a used Crown Victoria that's the only, or an SUV, and they're getting 15 miles a gallon and they're paying $3.50 a gallon for gas while everybody in the rest of the country is paying $2.50, and the people who set that policy often have a much smaller commute and have much more disposable income. I always say to people, they say, why is gas so expensive? And I said, because people who created the mandates don't commute like you do, and they surely don't drive cars like this because they have more disposable income. Not that they want to drive it, you know, nobody wants to drive a 20-year-old Crown Victoria, but when you buy it for $1,200, it's a little bit cheaper in the long run than buying a Tesla. But again, I think the problem we have with this state is that people have, I don't want to say lost their minds, but we don't consider, we're too trapped in this is left, this is right, this is progressive, this is conservative, he's a communist, he's a fascist. We don't just say, just forget all that and just say, when I advocate something, what is the effect on somebody else? And how would I live that life if my dreams came true? And I think if we did that, we would be what we used to be. California was a can-do, pragmatic state. I'll leave you one final thing. I think we're out of time, or maybe one, I don't know. But who was the one person who sued the state of California to make sure that we had a California water project? 1958. And who was he suing? The Sierra Club. The Sierra Club did not want a California water project. Jerry Brown's dad, Pat Brown, Attorney General of California. You should read the brief that he wrote. He said, we cannot allow the wishes of an elite to deny us water so that this state can grow and progress, and we can no longer be a state of 10 million people. We can be a state of 20 million, he thought. Never imagined 40 million. But there was an idea that, I grew up in a Democratic household, and that was the idea of the Democratic Party in California. Infrastructure, affordable living, affordable housing, affordable fuel, affordable electricity, populism for most of the people. No identity politics. We're all in the same boat together. My mother would make me go out and raise dollars for Democrats in the so-called barrio. You must have 8-hour day, 40-hour work week. But somewhere we lost sight of that. One last question?
We have time for one last question.
Yep.
All right, seeing none, I'm going to ask it.
Okay.
One of the things that I think San Mateo County would love to hear your perspective on is how best can our county work with the new administration in Washington?
Yeah. I'd say you can work with the new administration the way Tulare County worked with the old administration. How's that? And by that I mean Representative Nunes was I just mentioned him because in my congressman, 65-70% he's reelected. Most people are conservative rural farmers, and they worked with the Obama administration as much as they could, and they did it by being practical. I mean, they damned him in the abstract, but privately they tried to get with it. So you have to find areas that trump in a practical way, and what would that be? Transportation? I saw your poll. Most people are worried about roads. Trump talks about infrastructure, so we have to get over this idea that well, Trump said this about somebody, and therefore I hate everything about him, when he has a huge infrastructure program that might be more shovel-ready than the other infrastructure problem. Or the debt. We doubled the debt under Bush, and then we doubled it again under Obama. And interest rates are going up. And if you think you're going to service a $20 trillion debt at 6% and 7% interest rates, we're going to have money for nothing. So when he talks about changing the tax code or debt reduction, that's what we're interested in. We're interested in finance, infrastructure, and that should be more important than ideology. Ideology is fine, as in Britain, for 3 or 4 months, but it's not good for your whole life to be obsessed with it. And I'm at supposedly a conservative Hoover institution, and we had a poll in the last election. And we were shocked. We had senior fellows. 65% voted for Hillary Clinton. 35% the Hoover voted for. And so it's really become a non-ideological place, maybe center-left. But the point I'm making is that the people I know that I disagree with there, I have no problem with them. For me, the problem I have with them is they tell me that, you know, we don't need stored water, or we don't need the 99 to be fixed. So it's issues, but it's not ideology. And with that sermon, I'll let you go. Thank you very much.